We're diving into YouTube Lecture 8. It's from the Renewable Energy Resources course, GTT2105, delivered by Professor Pushpito Ghosh back in 2021 at ICT Mumbai.
And it's worth mentioning, this lecture, number 8, it kind of picks up where Lecture 7 left off, so there's some context there.
Good point. And this one focuses on 3 specific areas. What were they again?
Okay, so first, some really innovative ways they're managing spent wash that's a byproduct from ethanol production.
Okay.
Second, the potential for making ethanol from seaweed, which sounds pretty out there.
Seaweed. Right. And third?
And third, the really complex process of getting ethanol from lignocellulosic biomass, like agricultural waste.
Got it. Spent wash, seaweed, and lignocellulosics. And we should probably say that last one, the lignocellulosic biomass. It's complicated.
All right. The lecture spends a lot of time on it.
So we'll do the same. We'll aim for maybe roughly half our time today digging into that one, reflecting its weight in the lecture.
Sounds like a plan.
Our mission, as always, is to pull out the most interesting, the most insightful bits from the lecture for you, give you the knowledge without drowning you in detail.
So where should we start? Spent wash management.
Yeah, let's kick off there. So spent wash, what is it exactly?
It's basically the wastewater left over after you fermented something like molasses or sugarcane juice to make ethanol.
And traditionally it was a big problem, right? Environmentally.
It's a huge problem. Very high in what we call BOD and seed, biological and chemical oxygen demand. Essentially, it means it's full of organic pollutants.
Which pollutes water if you just dump it.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
sucks up all the oxygen. So disposal was a major headache.
But the lecture talks about a shift away from just treating it.
Right. Instead of just aerobic digestion, using oxygen to break it down, which isn't very productive, the focus shifted to anaerobic digestion.
Anaerobic, meaning without oxygen.
Correct. And the big advantage is that it produces biogas, mostly methane.
Ah, so you get energy back from the waste. That makes sense.
And the lecture points out the raw stuff has a massive energy potential, something like a BOD equivalent of 55,000.
Wow. That's a lot locked away in waste.
Yeah, but initially people just saw it as, well, waste. It's also very dark in color, which probably didn't help its image.
Okay, but then the lecture reveals something surprising about spent wash in India, from molasses specifically.
This is really interesting. High potassium content, like really high, around 16,000 parts per million.
16,000. What does that translate to?
It could be 1.6% potassium, or maybe even 3.2% if you calculate it as potassium chloride.
And why is that significant for India?
Well, India imports a lot of potassium fertilizer, potash. So imagine if you could recover that potassium from the spent wash, maybe as potassium nitrate.
Turning a waste stream into a valuable fertilizer source.
Exactly. Resource recovery. It's a paradigm shift.
Now, the lecture contrasts this with Brazil. They handle it differently.
Yeah, in Brazil, where they mostly use sugarcane juice, they often just put this spent wash directly back onto the fields. It's got nutrients, so it works for them.
But not so simple in India, especially after you've taken the biogas out.
Right. There are still concerns. Residual hydrogen sulfide, maybe, and that dark color people worry about for land application.
So that led to developing this new technology, the lecture details, a kind of zero waste approach.
Precisely. After the biogas production, they have a multi-step process.
Okay, break it down for us.
First, they get rid of the remaining organics, using things like activated carbon for adsorption, and also flocculation, precipitation, basically getting the gunk out.
Right, cleaning it up.
Then the clever part, recovering that potassium. The lecture mentions getting about 41 kilos of potassium nitrate from 1,000 liters of treated spent wash.
41 kilos from a cubic meter. That's substantial.
Definitely. And they also precipitate out sulfates, usually as calcium sulfate.
Yeah.
This helps reduce the overall saltiness, the TDS.
And water. Water is always crucial.
Big focus. They use reverse osmosis, RO, to recover about 70 to 75% of the water for reuse.
Wow, that's a pretty closed loop. Biogas, fertilizer, clean water.
It's a really integrated system. The lecture highlights it got recognition, even a letter from India's Prime Minister back in 2019.
It really shows that mindset shift, doesn't it? Asking, can we get more value here instead of just, how do we get rid of this?
Absolutely. Extracting multiple products makes the whole thing more economically viable, too.
Which is a perfect lead-in to the next topic. Looking for alternatives to traditional ethanol sources, like sugarcane.
Because sugarcane, as lecture points out, has a big footprint, right? Water use, land use.
Exactly. So the lecture introduces seaweed, specifically Capophycus alvaretzi.
Yeah, this variety was apparently brought to India from Japan. And it's seen as this really promising marine biomass, no land needed.
How do they grow it?
Out in the sea, on bamboo rafts using strings. And the lecturer says it grows pretty fast, harvest cycle of about 3 months.
And initially it wasn't grown for fuel, was it?
No, the main product was phycocolloids, basically seaweed gums. They're galactose-based sugars used in food, as thickeners and stabilizers.
Okay. But the advantages for biofuels seem pretty compelling, according to the lecture.
Totally. No competition for farmland, no need for fresh water, no fertilizers, no pesticides.
Although susceptible to diseases, the lecture notes.
True, that's a risk, but still huge potential advantages. And apparently, India demonstrated seaweed ethanol in a car way back in 2010.
Really? A 10% blend.
Yep, in an old Ambassador car. So the concept isn't brand new.
And the process for getting value out, it starts with crushing the seaweed.
Yeah, crush the fresh stuff, it's like 95% water. Then you separate the liquid filtrate.
And that liquid.
Turns out it's this amazing biofertilizer. The lecture calls it magical. Claims yield increases of 35%.
Wow. Has that been commercialized?
Seems so. Mentions a joint venture with IFFCO, and even Pepsi apparently licensed it previously.
So you get fertilizer, and what about the leftover solid part?
That's where the gum is.
Yeah.
So, again, multiple products from one source. Fertilizer and gum.
Okay, but scaling this up for biofuel, that sounds like a massive challenge.
Oh, yeah. The lecture talks about needing thousands of hectares
Yeah.
and potentially having to go further offshore, maybe 10, 20 kilometers out because coastal areas are busy.
And anchoring farms that far out?
Big technical hurdle. But the lecture mentions a cool idea. Using data on submerged islands. Apparently, the Navy might have this data as potential anchor points.
Creative thinking. Okay, so how do you actually make ethanol from the seaweed juice?
It's a process. First, saccharification, breaking down the complex sugars. They use mild dilute acid for this.
Then neutralization, presumably, and getting rid of salt?
Exactly. Salts can mess up the fermentation. So neutralize the acid, remove the salts.
And then ferment it, using special yeast.
Yep. You need yeast that can handle the specific type of sugars in seaweed, the galactose-based ones. The lecture says they identified suitable yeast strains.
Followed by distillation, like normal ethanol?
Right. Fractional distillation gets you maybe 80–90% ethanol, which you could then purify further, rectify it.
And the lecture mentioned an interesting energy-saving trick for drying the ethanol.
Yeah, this sounded quite novel. Using petrol itself to sort of pull the ethanol out of the ethanol water mix, then a final drying step. Cuts down on energy for distillation.
Huh. That's clever. This seaweed section really opens your eyes to possibilities beyond land crops.
Definitely pushes for a paradigm shift in thinking about feedstocks.
Okay, let's shift gears now to the big one. Ethanol from lignocellulosic biomass. This is the main focus, right?
Yeah, this is where the lecture really goes deep. We're talking about agricultural residues, rice straw, sugarcane vagus, stuff often seen as waste.
And the potential volume is huge.
Enormous. The lecture estimates maybe 200 million tons a year just in India, plus another potential 100 million tons from food waste.
But it's tough stuff to break down. What's it made of?
It's a complex structure. You've got cellulose, which is just chains of glucose. Then hemicellulose, made of other sugars, C5 sugars like dilose, and lignin.
Lignin. That's the tough, woody part.
Exactly. It's like the plant's structural glue. Very rigid, aromatic. Protects the sugars.
So it's not like paper, which is mostly cellulose?
Right. Paper processing removes a lot of the lignin and hemicellulose. Lignocellulose is the whole complex package.
And making ethanol gets harder as you go from sugar to starch to this stuff.
Massively harder. The key challenge, emphasized in the lecture, is the pre-treatment. You've got to somehow break through the lignin and expose the cellulose and any cellulose so enzymes can get at them.
And that pre-treatment takes a lot of energy.
A huge amount. The lecture stresses the need to look at the overall energy balance. Are you spending more energy breaking it down than you get out as ethanol?
Makes sense. So lignin's a barrier,
Yeah.
and the cellulose itself is hard to break down too.
Yeah, cellulose has a crystalline structure. Those chains are packed tightly, making it resistant to hydrolysis, the process of breaking it into simple sugars.
So what are the pre-treatment options the lecture discusses? Acid.
Acid is one route. You can use dilute acid or concentrated acid.
What's the difference?
Dilute acid needs high temperatures and pressures. Problem is, this can degrade the glucose you're trying to get, forming byproducts like HMF and furfural.
And those are bad for...
Fermentation. They inhibit the yeast. So you break it down, but then you can't ferment it efficiently.
Okay, what about concentrated acid?
More effective at lower temperatures, which is good, less degradation. But recovering the concentrated acid afterwards is tough, and handling it is tricky and costly.
So acid treatment has its issues. What else?
The lecture touches on other chemical methods: ammonia, alkali, organic solvents, ionic liquids. These are mostly research areas, often with their own cost or environmental concerns.
Ionic liquids sound interesting, though. Dissolving cellulose.
Yeah, the lecture highlights this as an exciting development. Mentions Robin Rogers' work, won a Green Chemistry Award. These liquids can disrupt the bonds in cellulose and dissolve it.
Opening doors for new materials, maybe?
Potentially, yes. Again, cost and recovery of the ionic liquids are big hurdles right now.
Okay, so chemical methods are complex. What about physical methods, like grinding?
Physical methods like mechanical grinding or steam explosion are mentioned. Steam explosion sounds dramatic.
How does that work?
High pressure, high temperature steam, then suddenly release the pressure. Bang. It helps break apart the structure.
Effective.
It helps, but it's very energy intensive and might not be complete. Still needs other steps.
And biological methods, using microbes.
Mentioned, but described as very slow. Not really practical for industrial scale yet.
So pre-treatment is clearly the bottleneck. But the lecture talks about a clever process strategy, SSF.
Ah, yes. Simultaneous saccharification and fermentation, SSF.
What's the idea there?
Instead of doing the steps, sequentially break down cellulose to sugar, saccharification, then ferment the sugar to ethanol. You do them at the same time in the same reactor.
How does that help?
As soon as the enzymes produce sugar from the cellulose, the yeast immediately ferments it into ethanol. Removing the sugar product helps drive the first reaction forward. It overcomes inhibition.
Ah, clever. Better yields.
Much better. The lecture mentions getting 90–95% theoretical yields, reaching maybe 4 or 5% ethanol concentration in 3 to 7 days, which is pretty good for lignocellulose.
And there was a surprising tip mentioned about the enzymes.
Yeah, apparently adding the whole broth from the enzyme production, not just purified enzymes, actually boosted activity in SSF, help utilize the substrate better. Unexpected synergy.
Interesting. What about just getting one super microbe to do everything?
Direct microbial conversion. Conceptually great. One bug does the pre-treatment, hydrolysis, and fermentation. But the lecture says it's not practical yet. Still a research goal.
Okay, so lots of challenges, but also progress. The lecture highlights work done at ICT Mumbai, right? With a pilot plant.
Exactly. A collaboration with India Glycol Limited. They set up India's first pilot plant for lignocellulose to ethanol, processing about 10 tons of biomass a day.
10 tons a day. That's moving beyond the lab bench.
Definitely. And the lecture details their specific process innovations.
Such as?
They have their pre-treatment, then they actually separate out the lignin fraction, which could potentially be used for other things, like surfactants and the hemicellulose sugars.
So they isolate the cellulose first.
Seems like it. Then they have a rapid enzymatic hydrolysis for that cellulose, claiming glucose production within just a day.
That's fast.
Very fast. And another key innovation, using membrane separation.
How does that fit in?
During hydrolysis, they continuously pull the sugar out through a membrane as it's formed. This lets them recycle the enzymes.
Ah, enzyme recycling would save a lot of cost.
Hugely important for the economics. And they also mention using a specific, potentially cheaper solvent for cellulose developed at ICT.
What was that?
A solution of sodium hydroxide, about 6–8%, with urea added. An ICT patent by Lally and colleagues, presented as a more cost-effective option.
So this pilot plant in Uttarakhand, what are the key claims?
The lecture highlights features like water recycle, enzyme recycle, and a remarkably fast overall process time, something like 13 to 14 hours, from biomass to ethanol.
That sounds incredibly efficient if it scales up.
It does. Technically very impressive. However,
There's always a however, isn't there?
the lecture does offer a dose of realism. It suggests that even with these advances, the overall economics might still favor making higher value products from lignocellulose, like pure cellulose or xylose sugars, rather than just ethanol fuel.
So maybe ethanol isn't the most valuable end product from this feedstock.
It might not be, economically speaking. The lecture references a similar analysis from UC Berkeley, suggesting that maybe just burning the biomass for power or converting it to biogas could actually be more profitable right now.
That's a sobering thought after all that complex processing.
It is. And another important point the lecture raises: don't just assume all this biomass is waste.
Right. It often has existing uses.
Yeah, like cattle feed or being plowed back into the soil. You can't just take it all without considering those impacts.
Good point. Availability isn't just about tonnage, it's about what's sustainably available.
Exactly. But then the lecture ends that section with a really thought-provoking twist, bringing seaweed back in.
Oh, how so?
They were extracting gibberellin, that's a plant growth hormone, GA3, from seaweed juice. And they found, kind of surprisingly, that applying this extract to corn increased the biomass of the corn plant, the leaves, the stem, by 26%.
Increase the stalks and leaves
Yeah,
without hurting the corn grain yield.
correct. Didn't negatively impact the actual corn harvest, but gave significantly more residual biomass.
Huh. So finding ways to maybe increase the amount of usable lignocellulosic biomass in the first place.
Precisely. It hints at innovative ways to boost the feedstock supply side itself. Very clever.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up, we've covered a lot from Professor Ghosh's lecture.
We really have. From smart ways to handle spent wash, turning waste into resources.
To the really intriguing potential of seaweed ethanol moving beyond land crops.
And then the deep dive into lignocellulosic ethanol, the massive potential, the huge technical hurdles, especially pretreatment, but also the ongoing innovations like SSF and the ICT pilot plant.
It's clear there's a ton of research and ingenuity going into all these areas.
Absolutely. And just to remind everyone, these insights came directly from that ICT Mumbai source, YouTube Lecture 8, Renewable Energy Resources course, GTT2105 by Professor Pushpito Ghosh from 2021.
Yeah, if any of this caught your interest, definitely check out the original lecture. There's way more detail than we could cover here.
For sure.
Which leaves us with, I guess, the final big question for you, the listener, to think about. Given all these different routes spent, wash, seaweed, lignocellulose, and all the challenges.
Where do you see the most promise?
Exactly. What do you think looks like the most sustainable, the most viable path forward for biofuels and maybe bio-based materials, too? It's complex, isn't it?
No easy answers. But hopefully this deep dive has given you some valuable insights and maybe spark some more curiosity about this whole field.